we have to stop thinking that we're like too fragile to do this. In fact, doing these sorts of things in a sensible way with a good plan and paying attention to our bodies and giving enough recovery and the nutrition to support it is how we become more resilient.
Wits and Weights community, welcome to another episode of the Wits and Weights podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Steph Gaudreau, sports nutritionist and lifting coach. I learned about Steph through her podcast, Fuel Your Strength, and I was immediately drawn in by her practical science-backed advice for women over 40 who want to step into their strength, and her philosophy that, quote, lifting weights is a catalyst for a more expansive life. Ooh, that's so good. In today's episode, we're getting into lifting, performance, and nutrition for athletic women over 40. And if you think you're not an athlete, think again. Steph will teach you about low energy availability, workout nutrition, carbs, protein, and of course, why you need to be strength training. We will address gym intimidation, the unique challenges for women over 40, and of course, the emotional and mental side of it all. Steph Gaudreau helps athletic women over 40 fuel themselves better, get stronger, increase their energy, and perform better in the gym. In her best-selling book, The Core 4, she details a 4-pillar approach to getting stronger, embracing your body, and owning your power. Steph is trained in biology and human physiology and is a certified sports nutritionist from the International Society for Sports Nutrition. She's also a USA weightlifting sports performance coach. Her podcast, Fuel Your Strength, started in 2015 and has over 4 million downloads. Steph, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So one story that you shared on, I think it's maybe on your Instagram profiles, that 11 years ago, a nutritionist said that you had, quote, surprisingly low food intake considering your volume and performance level. You said you were struggling with mood swings, soreness, nagging injuries, and that was a catalyst for learning what was going on with your body, and then eventually helping and educating other athletic women. So tell us more about that wake-up call and then what it led to.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'll try to keep it succinct because I know we have a lot of content to get through, but I've been an athlete my whole life, participating in everything from childhood team sports, all the way up through competing at CrossFit regionals, triathlons, all sorts of stuff. So I've been in it and done a lot of things, and really no one ever sat me down and said, you need to make sure you're eating enough and this is how you do it. And by the way, these are also the outcomes that can happen if you don't properly fuel yourself. It's not just your performance may suffer. And of course, as a performance minded person, that mattered a lot to me. So I had just come off of a very long period of time, about 8 years of racing bikes. I finished off at the sort of like endurance distance level. I was racing 12-hour solo races, 24-hour races on teams, like putting in so much work on the bike. Transitioned over to also doing Xterra triathlons, and then kind of burnt out from that and didn't realize at the time, looking back, hindsight is always 2020. You think, wow, a lot of that probably had to do with just being so underfueled, to really promote that burnout. And I transitioned over into lifting weights, which I'm super glad that, looking back, that thing happened to me, that I burned out. And I was like, I need to really get serious about just not basing like all of my self-worth on how small I can be and a lot of the things that I was doing that encouraged that, and found lifting and got really into lifting and really into CrossFit, which was great. But again, I still didn't have the knowledge of this is how we need to fuel for this kind of training. This is like a heavily glycolytic endeavor. You're doing a lot of heavy lifting. Like, this is how you would approach fueling in that way. My performance was really tapering off. I was starting to deal with a lot of injury. And I eventually said, does anybody here like work with a nutrition person? And at the time I was teaching high school, so I wasn't even in this career yet. And I connected with a sports nutritionist, and I, did a week worth of food logs, sent it into him, and basically got that reply back like, oh, wow. Okay. You're significantly under eating for the kind of training that you're doing. And that was really, I don't know if it was like, I think in the back of my mind, I knew something was going on, but again, I didn't know these principles at the time. And it was, it was hard. Like, I got a list of things I should improve. And I always tell people, like, I probably wasn't the most compliant client at the time, because I found some of the things were really challenging to me in terms of like the fears that I had, or not really knowing how to approach it. So that was a huge turning point for me. Excuse me. I went on a few months later, so that was kind of the end of 2012. Went on in 2013 in May to compete on a team at CrossFit Regionals, and I will tell you, I was like a different athlete at that time. Like
Mm.
it was an amazing weekend. I felt like I performed probably in the top 3 performances, like, in terms of athleticism and sport of my whole life. It was just I really turned it around, and making sure that I was eating enough was a huge part of that. So, it might sound really obvious to a lot of people, like, "Hey, you just gotta eat enough," but at the time, I mean, it wasn't something that was really going through the forefront of my mind. So,
Yeah, that's such a great story, and there's a lot of things I want to pick out of that. But
yeah.
even just the principle, like I'm a big fan of principles, and just the idea of it as fuel, or helping out with health and these other outcomes, and eating enough. Like you said, it's simple. Honestly, a lot of people just start there, and they don't need to worry about timing and
Mhm.
supplementation, let alone everything else. So you said originally you were told, or you found out that it doesn't just affect performance, but other
Mm.
health outcomes. So what do you mean
Yeah.
by that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, growing up, I was in high school in the 90s. People want to figure out how old I am. I'm 44. And, I had heard about things like, for example, female athlete triad. That was
Mhm.
a thing that came out. It was first came out in literature in 1992. So, kind of figure out the math there. Like it's something I had thought about, I had heard about, but I thought to myself, well, I don't have an eating disorder. I don't think I have osteoporosis, and I haven't lost my period. Well, actually, I don't know because I'm on birth control. So
Mm.
at that time, right, it was hard to say, like, did I actually have, would I have had a natural cycle if I was not on oral contraceptives? So, but in my mind, I was like, well, these are the 3 things that can happen to you if you don't eat enough. And I don't think I'm displaying any of these. So I should be fine. So, that's not the full story, right? And we know now that instead of just female athlete triad, right, that underfueling can affect athletes and athletic individuals. You don't have to be an elite athlete. You could be recreationally training, training for fun, just for your own improvement and enjoyment. But that underfueling affects all people, regardless of sexual,
Mhm.
assigned at birth, male, female, etc., and can affect all these different levels of athletic individuals. So, um, instead of just the female athlete triad, the symptoms of low energy availability and sort of the outcomes of low energy availability were expanded into something called red S. So,
Mhm.
relative energy deficiency in sport. The IOC came out with kind of their first statement on this in 2014, and then it was updated in 2018. And now more people are becoming aware that it's not just performance aspects that are going to take a hit if you're in this chronic low energy availability state. And you don't also, by the way, have to be a woman for this to affect you. So we see, things happening in all athletes. So it's not just our performance, right? We may have issues with our immune health, issues with our digestive health, issues with our psychological health. It's really across the board that we may start to see symptoms in what's going on as a result of underfueling.
Mhm.
So low energy availability being the driver, and that doesn't always mean that you're, intentionally under eating either, right? You could just have picked up a little bit more training. Maybe you're training for something new and you don't realize how much more energy you're expending. So you may not be purposefully under eating. But of course, you may see that there are outcomes because you don't have enough fuel coming in once you've accounted for your activity
Mhm.
level, which is what low energy availability really is, to maintain the optimal health of these other systems, right? So reproductive system, bone health, right, are some of the common ones that we might know about, but this is really can be a system wide or across organ systems outcomes that people are dealing with and may not even know that it's down to
Yeah.
the lack of energy intake.
Yeah, and that's huge because we often try to overcomplicate things when it comes to our health, that we need to address these 10 or 15 issues.
Mhm.
And you told us a story about both the mental side of this, like when you're talking about being focused on being small, right? Or how small you can
Mm.
be, and transitioning away from that, of
Yeah.
transitioning from high endurance sports to more strength focused, even though they were highly glycolytic, right? requiring lots of energy, for people who aren't familiar with the term, right? Glycogen and so on. And then men and women both face this. Now, do you find that it's women predominantly that have this issue in particular? Because so you've got people who are overweight, right? Or think are overweight or whatever term we want to use, that may have been gaining weight slowly over time. And then we have people that are maybe underfed. And then we
Mhm.
have people who are sedentary versus active in both those states.
Mhm.
So where do we break it up and categorize those different things in terms of the low energy availability you talked about?
Well, we really have to look at our activity level as kind of driving part of what's going on here. So we have our
Right.
basal metabolic rate, right, which is the amount of energy that we're going through if we were completely bedridden or lying down all day long. And this is such a simple concept, yet very misunderstood, right? In that our bodies are requiring energy to run all of our background processes even if we're doing nothing. A lot of times
Mhm.
we associate, oh, I went and exercised. So people will say things like, oh, I went and exercised. So like I quote unquote earned like this treat or this dessert, right? We have a lot of transactional relationships with like, I exercise, therefore I can
Sure.
eat more, or I'm like burning off that cheesecake. I mean, if we had a dollar for every time we've heard those sorts of things.
Mhm.
But we need energy even if we're purely at rest. So we have our basal metabolic rate. Then we have things like our non-exercise activity. So fidgety. I'm moving around here, moving my hands, uh, lifting up a fork. I mean, getting dressed, like putzing around your house, all those things, non exercise activity. We have our purposeful exercise, our purposeful activity, right? So we're gauging in
Mhm.
actual structured exercise. And then we have our thermic effective food, which is the small, relatively small amount that we're using energy to actually digest and assimilate the food that we're eating. So when we look at those things, like what can we shift the most? So we're talking about the difference between somebody, say, sedentary versus somebody highly active. There's could be a few things going on here. The bigger our body is, the more energy we are using. So that's
Mhm.
something to consider. But when we're looking at what do we have a lot of direct control over, it is sometimes those non-exercise activity moments, I guess we'll say. So like how kind of active are we overall? And then are we engaging in exercise, and like what is the intensity and duration of that? So we have a baseline energy need, and then we're going to be layering more on top of that based on those other factors. And I think that that's something where people can sometimes get a little bit stuck in the weeds of like, am I doing more moderate exercise?
Sure.
Am I getting
Zone
even,
2.
just a little bit of
Yeah.
exercise, versus somebody who's has a highly physically active job, is on their feet, maybe they're a laborer of some kind, like they're going to be going through a lot of energy. So it's not always just in the exercise portion that we need to look, but I think that that can give folks a pretty decent starting point to start kind of estimating where they're at.
Sure.
And then knowing, of course, if we're going to be doing something like strength training and trying to build up our muscle mass, like that means that, we're taking that longer view, but we are potentially adding more metabolically active tissue, like that will raise some of these energy consumption buckets, if you
Mhm.
will.
Yep.
And we can actually use that to our advantage.
Yeah, I sometimes talk about it as like increasing the size of the pie, right? When you build that
Mhm.
muscle mass. You've mentioned the word athlete a few times, so I definitely
Yeah.
want to dig into that. That's a fun part of this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
You're a sports nutritionist, you're a lifting coach, you have a
Mhm.
background in biology, background in physiology,
Mhm.
and you apply all these principles to athletic women over 40. So now how do you define athlete in
Yeah.
that context? Why women over 40 as well? I want to understand both aspects of that for you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think first and foremost, when it comes to the word or the concept of an athlete, there's a lot of gatekeeping around this
Mm,
term, frankly. And I've seen some hot takes on Instagram or the internet about like, oh, you're not an athlete unless you've ever competed in at least something in your life, or oh, you're not an athlete unless you're at this level of competency, or like let's say you compete on a national team or an international team. I mean, there's just
don't you
so
love it?
much.
People want to label everybody
There's
and
just
put them
so
in their
much,
box.
so
Yeah.
much debate. And to me, someone who's an athlete is somebody who's engaging in like intentional exercise, and you may have a goal in mind. Like you're showing up with purpose in what you do.
Mhm.
Period. Right. So that encompasses a lot of people. The problem with that is that that identity for a lot of people is something that they've taken off the table as an option. Maybe when they were in high school,
Mm.
they had to do I don't know, we had to run the mile presidential fitness
Mhm.
test, all that stuff. And maybe you were like, I sucked at this. I sucked at running. I hated it. Maybe you had a coach that really was like, you're not good enough to be on this team. You're not athletic. I got cut from freshman basketball. So I totally get it. No one gets cut from freshman basketball, by the way. So
Hey,
I
I hear
was,
you. I couldn't do a pull-up when I was that age, and it was
right?
embarrassing, you know?
Or you had to
Yeah,
climb a rope
yeah.
in gym class and you failed, or like whatever that happens to be. A lot of people have taken that off the table. Or we look up to elite athletes as setting the standard and
Mm,
saying, do you swim like Michael Phelps?
right.
Probably not. So
Or do
you're
you get
not an
paid,
athlete.
right? Or something, yeah,
Do you
yeah.
get paid to work out? Are you professional? Have you ever been to the Olympics?
Sponsored, yeah,
Probably
yeah,
not. So you're not an athlete. So we have that sense of I'm not an athlete, but that can affect that identity or that rejection of that identity, that piece of your identity, or working to become or not become a person who is athletic really changes the habits that you engage in, or
it
how
does.
you see
Yeah.
the importance of things like making sure we're eating enough. And like you said earlier, is everybody working out or training to the extent that they need to really worry as much about things like nutrient timing or supplementation? I mean, it's going to vary,
Mhm,
but at the end of the day, for somebody who is working to become a more athletic person or a more fit person, they might do things like understand that they need to prioritize their recovery a
mhm.
little bit differently, or like sleep is going to be more important, or making sure that they're not skipping a bunch of meals every day. And this is where the rubber meets the road for most people that I work with, most of the women that I work with, right? They're trying to figure out, okay, once I have that knowledge and I'm leaning into that identity, how am I actually going to do that? Like, what are the systems, the structures, the environments, the social support that I need in order to make these things happen?
Oh, it's so good. Showing up with purpose in what you do, right? It's kinda like the
Mhm.
difference between training and exercise when we talk
Yes.
about lifting. Ah, it's the
Yeah,
same thing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so why women over 40? It's hard to define exactly when perimenopause begins because it's different for every person, right? It could be your late 30s, you start noticing changes. It could be your late 40s, right? We have this like window of time for the most part, unless it's an early onset, which is a different kind of condition to deal with.
Mhm,
But looking at that, just that transition that we're going through, right? Going through a physiological transition from premenopause into postmenopause. And also, the reason I say over 40 is there's just a lot of challenges that happen in this phase of life.
mm,
Like midlife is no joke, right? So you might have mounting pressures at work. You might have shifting family dynamics. Maybe you have kids and your kids are getting older and they're like leaving the nest, so to say. Maybe they're like not leaving the nest and you have to deal with that. I don't know. Relationship challenges, those sorts of things. And then, of course, the biological challenges that are going to come with that and how it affects how people see themselves as well. So there's, a lot of continued body image challenges that women are dealing with, understanding how our training potentially needs to change. So we're looking at how do we, not necessarily make drastic changes, but how are we going to understand why we're shifting in the way that we are? And even things as simple as giving yourself more flexibility. Whereas before, when you were younger, you might have just been able to really power through no matter what,
yeah,
right? Or really just burn the candle at both ends and not pay as much attention to some of the other stuff like soft tissue recovery and some of the other things that we know we need. And then also, of course, looking at the muscle and bone elements as well. But
mm,
things are shifting and changing. And are we going to continue to just harken back to what we always did because it's familiar? Which, by the way, change is scary and doing new things is scary. So we need support.
mhm.
But, are we going to just keep going back to what we did because it's the familiar, or are we going to evolve our training as we go? And
Yeah, yeah.
that's the $1,000,000 question.
Yeah, and it can be a very exciting new phase of your life. It really can. I
Mhm,
mean, I'm 42, so we're similar age
mhm.
range, and I didn't personally focus on my health as much as I could have, should have, whatever, until I was almost 40 when, the rubber hits the road. You're getting to this current turning point in your life, and like all the decisions of your youth are finally catching up. Like they really are.
Mhm.
You made those decisions at a time when they didn't really affect you. And
Yeah.
now they're kind of accumulating. But you have something that you can do about it, which is the empowering message that I think you have. And when you add
Mhm.
like women over 40 into the mix, where there's other things that because of biological reasons and otherwise from hormones that can make it confusing and complicated, but you try to cut through that and help them move forward. So it's super inspiring. Let's talk about, what do we want to talk about next? Let's talk about we talked about fueling your training, and the importance of just basic energy needs. But now let's go to the next level of importance beyond that, whether
Mhm.
it's macronutrients, timing, carbs, protein, all that fun
Yeah.
stuff. And by the way, for those listening, if you don't already listen to Steph's podcast, like you break these things down in detail each episode, like very clearly. So it's a like masterclass and all this stuff.
Trying.
Uh, so just for the different modes of training,
Yeah.
what are the basic recommendations here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if we're thinking about being over 40 in
Mhm.
general, the first thing that we need to think about is our protein intake across the board. I mean, whether you're, yeah, there's some variants. Like, are you heavily into like endurance sports, ultra endurance sports, like how you slice and dice sort of your protein versus carbohydrate and
Mm.
fat is going to vary a little bit. But what we know for the most part from the research is like if we're looking at aging and we're looking at things like basic protein needs, we're going to need more protein as we age, not less, which surprises a lot of people because they're like, but, what,
Yeah.
maybe I'm not as active or I'm not lifting as quote unquote as heavy. But we, especially if we're going through the perimenopause into menopause transition, we're starting to see kind of a shift in the balance of, unless we're doing something about it, right? Of more muscle protein breakdown versus muscle protein synthesis, the loss of estrogen and its effects on, muscle satellite cells and kind of getting nerdy about that science and not
No,
to
let's get one extra nerdiness on that, because I always wonder about this. I know
yeah.
the muscle protein synthesis slows with age. I know in women, I believe that accelerates also
Mhm.
with the age. Is it solely a function of the things you just mentioned, or is it also because you have not been building that muscle mass,
Yeah.
and then that correlates with age?
I think we're seeing, eh, a push to include that in the conversation. Like, are we solely seeing that like aging and that loss of muscle mass, and then potentially like clinical levels of sarcopenia, which is muscle loss?
Mhm.
Like, is that solely due to inactivity and like lack of lifting and so on and so forth, or is that just natural aging and so on
Sure,
and so forth? And I think the answer, if I had to make a guess, is probably it's a little bit of both.
a little bit of both.
And
Yep.
so, of course, if we stay strength training, for example, through our 40s, 50s, 60s, like, can we maintain a portion of what we've built, right? Like,
Mhm.
can we build more tissue? Yes. Like, does it mean we're going to experience no loss of, for example, muscle tissue or bone? It seems to be, as far as I'm aware, that we're still going to have some loss,
Mhm.
right? And as far as what the research is saying, so it's probably a little bit of both. And I think this is the thing that makes it exciting slash hopeful for
Mhm.
people is like there are things we can do, and I think that that's I will keep coming back to that because if we feel like it's hopeless, like that's where we get a little bit into those mindsets of like, what's the point? Why bother? And then we know that we can positively affect that. So, yes, like having adequate protein intake to help drive muscle protein synthesis and in combination with resistance training.
Mhm.
We see so many studies where they're looking at the things like sort of the effect of whether it's creatine supplementation on bone. And I was just talking to Dr. Darren Kando about this. They did this big study in Canada on this, and they looked at creatine supplementation along with resistance training. So if we have that mechanical tension from resistance training, we have that microscopic damage to our muscle tissue that then causes growth and repair. We have an adequate protein intake to support that,
Mhm.
that we're going to see a better outcome. So, women in general, I think again, what it comes down to for people is like not in the knowledge of like, oh, I need more protein, but then what does that actually look like? And how do I do that in
Mhm.
all of the habits that I have? But yeah, looking to have that adequate protein intake. And, just like ballpark here, we're kind of looking in that 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg body weight range. There's lots of ways that you're gonna like customize this for you.
Yep.
So,
Mm.
but that's more than even kind of what the going level for sedentary individuals is these days, which is more like that 1.2, maybe a little bit
Right.
higher. So yeah, we need more protein for sure. And then looking at carbohydrate intake, just based on, again, like what does our training look like? What does our activity look like? Are we endurance athletes that were, training for a marathon or something of that nature where we're doing a lot more just we have a lot more energy expenditure and output. Are we doing a lot of glycolytic training? If I'm, for example, somebody who's mainly lifting weights and walking, does my carbohydrate level need to be at the level of somebody training for an Ironman?
Mhm.
No, unlikely,
Mhm.
right? So
Yep.
understanding how we have our total energy needs and then how we divvy that up. Protein is kind of it's like the middle of that seesaw, like kind of staying consistent because we have that absolute need for protein. And then how do we like raise the carbohydrate need, and then sort of like balance it out with our fat intake so that we're in that, isocaloric range.
Right.
We're trying to build a little bit. We're maybe a little bit over, but we're making
Quick
sure that like those pieces come together.
Yeah, quick follow-up on the protein versus carbs for endurance athletes. I don't know how
Mhm.
many of those types of athletes you work with versus just the run-of-the-mill gen pop who lifts and walks and does
Mhm.
some cardio.
Yeah.
Is the concern more toward, like, lead up to an event and then the event itself, or is there a continual period during the training that you kinda have to sacrifice a bit of that protein to get the carbs in?
I tend to not work with people who are really in that
Yeah.
very long endurance slash ultra endurance crowd. I am working more with more people now though who are understanding the importance of just cardiovascular training and like you're doing more of that cardiovascular training. Is it always like at an intense level? No. But again, it's like you may have to shift again looking at the our sort of like total energy need and then how we partition that out. There are some people who are doing ultra endurance type
Mhm.
pursuits and they end up shaving a little bit off of their protein need just to account for the extra carbohydrate need. But I think we're coming to understand that like we need to kind of keep that as high as possible without sacrificing any muscle mass in the process or as little sacrificing as little muscle mass in the process. And that is definitely something that I experienced when I was doing all my endurance training. And again, I was doing kind of like ultra, not ultra, but like longer endurance events. I was just like, could not hang on to muscle mass. Muscle was
Yeah.
just like sliding off my body at, at a certain point because I just was not keeping up with my overall calorie needs and my protein. I have no idea if I had to like even think about how much protein I was eating, but it
Right.
wasn't very much. So
You had priorities, for that mode of training, yeah.
yeah, so sometimes they'll scoot it down, they'll scoot, protein down a little bit to account for, like, the higher calorie allotment that needs to go to carbohydrate.
Okay. So let's say a client comes in who has kind of the, I guess, traditional narrative of, like, feel they need to lose some weight.
Mhm.
Are you working primarily in the kind of body recomp and lifting and muscle building side of the phases, or do you also dip into fat loss regularly with your clients?
I am pretty much solely focused on how do we help get you stronger and put some muscle
Okay.
on your body.
I figured. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's
there
cool.
there are
Yeah.
a lot of clients or a lot of students that I have who will have a desire at some point to do some body recomp, and, I think, like, that's if they wanna go and, like, seek that out, like, secondarily, but I think there's this notion that we have to diet down and then we're gonna go do muscle
Mm.
building,
Yeah, you hear that a
um,
lot. Yep.
so I'm like, let's get you focused on building what you need to build, like get your strength up, like lay the foundation of getting some more muscle on your frame so that you are able to see your metabolism be a little bit more resilient and like
Yes.
less leveraged down into this like little box of, I don't know, that like 1,000 to 1,300 calorie range that a
Mhm.
lot of women are in this like they're like I can't seem to like eat anymore or I see my body composition start shifting in a way that I don't like and I'm like we need to slowly get you eating a little bit more, like relax some of those like restrictive rules that you've had and get you to a place where you're more stable, like what I would basically call more like maintenance. And then if you want to go and pursue that other stuff. But if you try to just go on, try to do a fat loss phase, your protein is not adequate and you're not resistance training,
Yeah.
we're going to end up in the same exact
Yeah.
situation that you've
Agree.
been in, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's the tactic that I personally take with my clients and my students is like, let's get you to that more to that maintenance level. Like, let's get you feeling strong. Let's get you feeling like you can sleep again. Your recovery is better. You're feeling better overall. And
Hmm.
then like then if it's necessary for you to kind of dial things back. But the problem is, like I said, a lot of my clients come in and they realize they've been under eating. They don't have a lot of distance left to cut, if any at all.
Hmm.
And if they do, they're going to end up eating less than their basal metabolic rate or pretty close to it. And you tend to feel not so hot if you're doing
No,
that for
not a good thing.
long periods of time. So,
Okay.
that's my approach
Well,
with
that
folks.
I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to invite you on because I think we need to have more of that message. There are many,
Mhm.
many, many, dieting type coaches out there, and
Sure.
not enough talking about building first. And I've seen it with clients as well who came in wanting to lose weight and hold on, let's just hang out here for a while and start lifting weights. And you just see a transformation in their mindset in
Yeah.
so many ways. I think just the act of lifting and the physiological and hormonal response from that just elevates your mood. There's actual pathways, right, that
Mhm.
make us feel better about what we're doing. And then as the waist size decreases anyway, you're like, okay, as a side benefit, it is improving my body composition. So
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
People, I think, just end up coming to a bit of a more I'm not gonna say it's without challenge.
Hmm.
I mean, people are always like, "Oh, when you started lifting weights, like, did you get smaller? Did you lose weight?" And I'm like, "No, I got bigger. I had to get bigger clothes."
Hmm.
But
That's
was way
truth, man.
happier, felt way better. I think it's important to have those conversations too, and recently I was chatting with a friend of mine, on her Instagram post, Jen Hosler, and we were talking about, we're like, "Women, you won't get bulky if you lift," and it's like, but we had to also be nuanced about this, like, if your your muscles are probably gonna grow,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
they're
for
probably gonna
sure.
grow. I know for me, I used to be a teacher and I would have all these, like, cute blouses with, like, the little sleeve cap sleeves, like, and I was like, "I can't wear that stuff anymore." I had to get new shirts and, those sorts of things. So, yeah, it's
Yeah,
not without
but it's dense
challenge.
though. Muscle tissue is dense, so there is that, right? Yeah,
There is that, and it just makes you all around better at life, and, we were talking earlier about, like, a more expansive life, and that's really,
yeah.
um, you know, you're feeling of, like, you can be with people and, like, focus on the moment and not being worried about, like, what your weight was on the scale
Mm,
this morning
right.
or, feeling like you can put that suitcase in the overhead bin, and it's nice that someone offered to help you, but you could do it on your own if you had to.
Hmm.
Just like little things like that. You have experiences
If
you
I saw you in a plane, I would not offer to lift your suitcase. I'd be like, "You got it."
you'd be surprised. You'd be
No, I
surprised.
might out of politeness, but yeah, right.
But yeah, it's that idea of like getting back up to that maintenance level or of shifting in terms of like your mindset on things. And I have a couple of newer students who on their own accord, they're both friends and they were like, "Oh, we decided like to get rid of our scale." And then they went through their closet and like took all the clothes that weren't fitting them and they put them aside
Hmm.
and those sorts of things. And it is a shift in your mindset, it is a shift in like your approach. And especially if you've been used to being really restrictive, um, flipping that around and saying like,
Yeah,
having an inclusive or an additive approach or thinking about like
yeah,
what can I
additive.
include here that I haven't included
Hmm.
before is
Yeah,
it
like
is a different way
crowd
of
other
looking at
things
things.
out by adding things in. Yes. W-
Yeah, for sure.
You mentioned much earlier when we started that when you started working with your nutritionist, you weren't entirely compliant because of fears and limitations. Is this what we're
Yeah.
talking about? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so when he came back to me and, we looked at my food logs and I've, like, literally taken screenshots of these so people can see, like, I'm not just making this up. There was definitely a day in my week where I was, like, about 1,000 calories-ish. There were many days where I was 60 grams of carbs, and
Yeah,
training for competitive level CrossFit.
yeah, and that's keto basically. Yeah.
But I had been eating so low carb for so long that that was just kind of how it wasn't even just well, everybody's talking about you just need to like cut your carbs so you can be lean. which was one of the things I definitely I was like, I just still want to like stay lean. I was like really concerned about body composition, which again is we're talking about performance here,
Mhm.
but also this like mixing this with aesthetics, right? So that's something to be aware of. But my carbs were really low. My protein was pretty low as well. And that just gave me an overall really low energy intake.
Mm.
And so the thing I was like running headfirst into was to change my protein intake, which is generally what I recommend for my clients anyway. Is like if we're going to start anywhere, like let's start with a little bit more
Right.
protein and see how that goes. But when I kind of like went through this 3-phase approach to working with him, the next time we checked in, and he's like, so what's going on with this like carb intake?" And I was doing a little bit better, but still
Yeah.
far too low. I mean, again, it was like less than 100 grams of carbs a
Right.
day.
And you had to
It
be
was
in the 200s or something, right?
yeah, like
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
at least.
it was it was definitely the thing that I was the most resistant to. And this was back in the day, like we weren't doing, we wouldn't have Voxer or WhatsApp check-ins or those sorts of things. It was like once a month I would email him with like the
Mhm.
progress. So I think what I needed was more support in terms of just talking through those challenges, those mindset challenges or the beliefs that I had or even something as simple as and he did talk about this like in the feedback, but again, you kind of need to talk to a real person and just work through it sometimes or hear that other people are going through this, but is like, well, this is why we need carbs, especially in our post workout and those sorts of
Mhm.
things. But it was still scary because I had been in that like eat low carb for so long that shifting that was a mental bit of a mental hurdle at the time. It took a lot of time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I've seen that as well, and it does seem to
Hmm.
be more the case with women than men for whatever reason. Both the protein side with like meat eating habits, like men
Hmm.
are happy to scarf down just tons of meat without thinking about it. There's a
Yeah.
difference, right? And
Yeah.
then the carbs, especially if you're conditioned with the low carb or the keto diets
Hmm.
of late, and
Yep.
when you make that change, all of a sudden it's like, why is everything feeling better? Why am I sleeping better? All of a sudden I can lift more. Da 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 da. It just spirals into good stuff. Yeah,
I'll tell you this, some of it is very cultural,
yeah.
and, I've even
Yeah.
had clients tell me that they would go out to eat, and this has actually happened to me. Go out to eat, you order, someone else brings the food out, and they give you the wrong dish. Like, I've had, for example, I've gone out and ordered, a steak with potatoes or something, and my dining companion, who's a guy, ordered
Oh,
a
okay.
salad,
Here you
and
go.
they bring the salad to me, right? There's just assumptions. Or I had a client tell me one time that she was reluctant to eat all the food on her plate because she felt it would be emasculating to the
Hmm.
person she was eating with. So we have all of these
Deeply
really
enmeshed
baked in,
stereotypes, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
narratives about like if you're a woman, you have to eat really dainty, tiny portions, and how that intersects with diet culture, and then how that affects how we eat as athletic people.
Mhm.
And it's impossible to just talk about it in a silo when we start to pull back and see all those layers and how
Sure,
they affect each other.
sure. So I wanna get a little bit into some couple questions my community wanted me to ask you because they were
Okay.
super excited that you were coming online or coming on the podcast.
I'll
Just
do
a
my
couple, and
best.
then I have a few others then. One is about food intolerances. So,
Yeah.
I've got clients, for example, with Hashimoto's, right, who have to
Mhm.
avoid all sorts of things, gluten, grains, beans, dairy. It kinda sounds like the paleo diet that I used to eat in
Yeah.
a way,
Yeah.
or even more limited, and that limits their carb options, which is exactly what we're talking about, which is why I wanted to segue. It's like, "Okay, you
Yeah.
want me to eat 300 grams of carbs? I eat almost no foods that can give me carbs. What do I
Yeah.
do?"
This is tough. And I do have a lot of students who have food intolerances, clients as well. So like you said, whether it's dairy, which can make protein a challenge or just harder, right? To limit your options or, like you said, gluten containing grains. I think that the end of the day, you have to just find what works and run with that. And that could mean, for example, if you can tolerate, I don't know, we're talking about like tubers. So potatoes, sweet potatoes, etc. Like let's get you as much variety within your
Mm,
limitations as possible and work toward the most variety as you possibly can get, and understanding too, and I see this a lot with these with individuals that have this challenge is sometimes they gravitate a little bit, they lean into, I'll say because of necessity, really fibrous like fruits and vegetables
mm.
as kind of the basis of what they're doing. And again, if they're doing long training, endurance training, or intense training, it's like, how do we get the density of carbohydrates that we need, especially around training?
And the digestibility, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so sometimes it's like, this food is just so high volume, which is fiber is great, right? We need enough fiber, so
Now we needed
important.
something else. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
but like, so it could be, for example, like maybe they're able to tolerate something like banana. So eating banana post workout or something like that instead of a fluffy salad,
Yep.
because the salad might have some carbohydrate in it, primarily from fiber or what you put on top of it. But maybe they're able to tolerate something like white rice. And so, like, looking for those options. And yeah, I have so much empathy for people who are in that position, because it's just a little bit more limited in terms of what they can oftentimes tolerate. But usually, if we work closely enough, we're able to sort of like explore other options. And I'll say this too, there were definitely foods I gravitated away from when I was eating more low carb, not necessarily because of necessity, but because like that's just what you did.
Right.
And I would go through the grocery store and it was like I couldn't even see these.
Yeah. You
I
just
couldn't
blanked it
see.
out.
It just blanked it out, right? And
Yeah.
so I oftentimes have that conversation with people that are like, "Oh, I stopped eating fruit."
There you go. It's an
Really? And so,
entire
like,
group right there.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. So,
It's true.
potentially, could you add in maybe some fruit or, like I said, potatoes? I know so many people that were like, oh, I reintroduced them. I know on autoimmune protocol, I think that's one of the things you eliminate for a while. And then you can kind of welcome back in potentially and just test and see how you do. And there are some denser carbohydrate options that aren't like gluten containing grains for
Yeah.
people. So,
No, that's good. Regarding variety, what came to mind is, of course, there's many ways to cook things too, right? So if you're going to eat
mhm,
potatoes, it's
yeah,
not like in a prison where they're going to give it to you the same way every day. You get to
sure.
fry and this, not fry, but cook them a million different ways. Yeah.
Totally, and I will say for people that are trying to just get in enough calories, like, that's a concern for them. Sometimes we talk about, like, "Oh, liquid, like, don't eat your calorie or don't drink your calories, you should be eating your
Mm.
calories," and it's like, actually, to some people, that can end up working against them. So, if you're somebody who is struggling to get enough food to meet your activity level and you do have some more limited options, like, could you put it in a smoothie and drink it
Yep.
post-workout or something, just so you're able to, like, chew a little bit less?
Yeah.
And
Increase the density. Yeah.
yeah, again,
Yeah.
some people will be like, "I need to do the opposite," and that's why customizing and personalizing is so important.
Cool. Yeah. And there's something like there's highly branched cyclic dextrin too, I guess, as an
Mhm.
option
Yeah,
for carbs. Yeah.
totally.
Uh, and then what about women fueling their training based on their menstrual cycle or their
Oh,
menopause status? Kind of two
yeah.
different things. Yeah.
So this is really, really interesting because if we look at, for example, what happens in terms of the menstrual cycle, and we're looking at protein oxidation or carbohydrate oxidation. So, for example, let's take protein. Protein oxidation or protein breakdown seems to increase in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. And I have seen, it's like a bad game of telephone. I think people are well intentioned, but what I have seen on social media is that translates into, literally, I saw one time there was a post that said you should eat twice as much protein in the luteal phase. And I was like,
This massive reaction to it, right? Yeah.
wow, like,
Yeah.
oh, that's right. That's a big leap, especially if you're already getting a pretty adequate amount of protein. So, I think we need to be a little bit cognizant of this cycle-based eating, cycle-based training even. Like, we do not currently have enough research to draw universal recommendations on exercise, like how to shift all of your exercise depending on what week of the menstrual cycle you're in.
Would there ever be, because it's can vary so much from person to person?
Well, and that's the thing that it's
Yeah.
as of what we know right now, the best recommendations that we have are an N equals 1 approach to that
Fair enough.
training.
Yeah.
And again, this is kind of where you see like those circle graphs on social media. It's cut into four pieces, and each wedge is like 1 week of the menstrual cycle. And it's like, in week
Mm.
1, you should do this. In week 2, you should do this. In week 3, you should do this. And I'm like, most people are struggling to even find like some kind of consistency in their schedule than to have to plan 4 different weeks of like exercise. Now, does that mean we shouldn't be flexible? Of course not. Like, there's going to be some days where, or some weeks where maybe you feel great the last week of your cycle, maybe you feel terrible. You you kind of play it by ear and give yourself flexibility. And that's where that N=1 approach is really important. There are some things you can think about in terms of just overall nutrient intake, like making sure.
Yeah.
But I think what it comes down to is, again, like those basic principles, like you said at the top of the show. And I'm really big on principles as well. Like when we include more variety, we cover more of our micronutrients,
Mhm.
right? Versus having just a few different foods that we eat. Making sure we're getting adequate protein intake and getting as high quality protein as we can means we're getting adequate amino acid intake, right?
Mhm.
So yes, there are some things to consider. You mentioned menopause. I mean, we have a risk of cardiovascular disease that increases as women once we're in that menopause window, which is then going to be for the rest of our life. We see an increase in cardiovascular risk. So saturated fat intake, for example, could be really important to just kind of keep an
Sure.
eye on that. Calcium intake going to be important for bone health, along with other factors, right? So these things don't exist in a silo in
Yeah.
terms of how they're being metabolized and used in the body. That protein intake we talked about, if somebody is experiencing, for example, insulin resistance, is it necessary to like not eat any carbohydrates ever again? Probably not. That's probably not going to be really work for people.
Mhm.
There are some people who I think are like, I find this incredibly liberating, but that's where we have to be really careful about making sure you're eating enough again
Right.
to like cover your
Right.
carbohydrate need. But that might just be less sugar, less like refined sugar, less alcohol,
Mhm.
more whole foods, more fiber. And that doesn't sound trendy slash sexy or proprietary. Unfortunately, this is just kind of like common sense or basic, like sound nutritional
It's
advice. And
first principles, yeah. Yeah, and
so
oftentimes people ask these questions,
sure.
and it's the wrong question because they may not
Yeah.
be doing these other things first.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there are things like energy balance. So, if weight increase is a concern, is like, are we just how are we helping you kind of eat enough volume of satiating foods, right? So that
Right.
you're, not just constantly eating because you don't feel satisfied. Those things can be on the table depending on what the person comes in with. But I will say a lot of people who I run into in this category are also dealing with like food as an emotional coping mechanism
Mhm.
and other things that are more than just knowing how much food to put on your plate, which is
Sure.
again why that support and working with somebody who can help you tease through all these things can really be useful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we can shout from the rooftops all the strategies, exactly what you need to do from A to Z, and you can have the answer to every single question. As you know,
Mhm.
that isn't always enough when you're dealing with these other issues. So
Sure.
underlying all of this is being an athlete and
Mhm.
aging, and how we maximize this phase of life is lifting, right? We haven't really talked too much about lifting, like in specific, but let's do it.
Yeah.
So, what are I mean, and I've talked about it a lot on the show too, but I want to hear from you. Like, what are the real big benefits of lifting, especially for women over 40? And then we
Yeah.
can segue into some basic recommendations on getting started there.
Yeah. So, I think I mentioned earlier, we need enough mechanical tension as part of, how our muscle is actually going to, like, grow and repair and build. So it's important that we're lifting challenging enough weights. Again, like, for a lot of people, they're like, "Ah, like, I already know this." But lifting challenging enough weights so that you're able to have the stimulus to then you have your repair, you have your fatigue, you have your repair, and then you have your adaptation. So we need enough stimulus to provide that adaptation. And unfortunately, because society has a narrative that people who are like over 40 are basically 1 foot in the grave, which is ridiculous. We should only do easy
For sure.
stuff. You should only do gentle exercise. This is going to hurt your joints. Like we
Yeah.
have, we
It's
have
dangerous. It can hurt your
Oh,
back,
you're
on
gonna
and
get
on and on.
hurt,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you've got a bad knee from, something that happened when you were 20, like and of course, there can be pain without injury and injury without pain, and, like, that's all a pain size is very complex, and I'm not gonna pretend to be an
Mhm.
expert in this, but disuse is also a huge problem. Like, if we're not using our muscles, we're not using our body, like, things are gonna start to hurt, we get those aches and pains. Do you need to go bench press 400 pounds in your garage? Of course not. But we need to be sensible about this stuff and understand that physiologically, if we expect our body to get stronger, we have to apply a stimulus that we can then get an adaptation from. And so if we're only ever lifting tiny little weights and I get served these reels on Facebook, Facebook must think, it knows I'm in my mid 40s and it serves me the craziest reels. Like, I can't even tell you. I saw one the other day that was like, do this exercise to tone your turkey neck. And
Oh
I took a
God.
screenshot and sent this to some. This is the content that we're getting, right? Where everything is a tiny weight
Yeah. Colored dumbbells.
and
Yeah.
everything is done for like 20 to 30 reps, which
Mhm.
is isn't in, is muscular endurance invalid? Of course not. But when we see these things again as women over 40, we're like, there's still a lot of verbiage like, I want to get toned, I want to, look
Right.
XYZ. And then painting the picture of what it takes to actually get there um is very misleading. So do we have enough stimulus? Are we lifting heavy enough? Are we following progressive overload? Are we taking care of our soft tissue, right? Because as we lose estrogen through the menopause transition, our ligaments, tendons, and you see, I have I've hurt my finger at jujitsu a couple months ago, so I'm dealing, I think, with some of this as well. But it's like we're just those connective tissues aren't quite as forgiving as they used to be, right? Maybe the rest of our life has become very sedentary. Then we go in the gym and we expect our body to do a lot of stuff. So, are we taking care of our soft tissue? Are we introducing exercises that help us to stay powerful and to also help with our bone density, right? So plyometrics, are we including those? Again, these are like things that I'm talking to my students and my clients about. And they're like, "Oh, but I heard jumping is bad for you." And I'm like, "Well, we are going to have to help you start doing it with good mechanics, but sitting and doing nothing is also not helping." We will tend to lose type 2 fibers, right? That shift from type 2X
Mhm.
tends to slide toward type 1. And so are we able to move powerfully? Are we avoiding that dynapenia, right? Which is the kind of sister to sarcopenia, which is the loss of explosive power. If we feel like we're slowing down, but are we training in that way? Are we doing cardiovascular training? And that's like a whole other thing too, but it's not like one or the other. There's
Yeah.
a reason why the exercise guidelines in this country, as well as in Canada, and I'm sure other countries, includes both. So we have to stop painting one against the other. We have to stop thinking that we're like too fragile to do this. In fact, doing these sorts of things in a sensible way with a good plan and paying attention to our bodies and giving enough recovery and the nutrition to support it is how we become more resilient
Yeah.
physically. Yes, you may have to adapt things. And so I hear this a lot also from people in my community, which is like, I can't do squats. And I'm like, guess what? There's like 100 other ways we can work your, leg muscles. So like, let's
If
find.
that's even a true statement, and you want to be empathetic
I
to
know.
people,
Yes.
but then you also
Yes.
want to unravel that and be like, what do you mean?
I
Because
know.
I just had somebody like 3 weeks ago who was saying that, and it was like my hip flexors and this and that and the other, and I'm like, can
Mhm.
you squat to a box
Yeah.
without any weight? Yeah, no problem. I
Mhm.
said, then you can squat. I think
Yeah.
you can squat. Put a broom
Yeah.
handle and start adding a little weight. Let's see if you can do that. And then the next step, and the next step. But I think,
Totally.
people are afraid because they probably
Yes.
haven't squatted since they were like 8,
Mhm.
and it's just a weird position, and there's lots of balance issues and all this other stuff, right?
Yeah,
So
well,
I just wanted to throw that
pain
in
is
there, right?
scary
Yeah,
too, right? People
yeah,
are afraid of pain is like
yeah.
not a fun thing. And unfortunately, and this is like even kind of a shift in like how PT is being addressed. And again, I'm not a physical therapist, but
Mhm.
friends with people who are more in the new school, which is like we have to be really careful about psychologically what we put in people's minds about pain or about what it
Right,
means or about like
right.
giving them that, like, then lifelong sense of limitation that you can't or shouldn't. I have a client who was told she shouldn't hinge, and I was like, "It's just farmer's carries with kettlebells." I'm like, "Well, how do you do your farmer's carries?" And she was like, "Oh, yeah. Okay." So she's like she's
Uh-huh.
hinging, right? How do you do anything? How do you pick something up
I
off the
pick
floor?
something up. Yeah.
So obviously, like, are we gonna load this client with her max conventional deadlift, like, on day 1? Of course not. But looking for ways to modify movements, to work up to movements,
Yeah.
to, drill sound mechanics, but without making people afraid. I think is so lacking in, especially in people over 40, and then like just learning that, hey, if you've and I see this all the time, it's like you've come off a period of inactivity, which is fine, but we also have to like pull you back a little bit sometimes if you
Mhm.
have that athlete mentality,
Sure. It's the other side of it, yeah.
because you're like, all right, I'm gonna go gusto. Like my first workout back was Murph. Like, let's not do that because you're not gonna walk for 3 weeks,
Oh, yeah.
right? Or give
Oh, it's
yourself
so funny.
rhabdo.
So and there's a cause and effect that sometimes it's turned around. Like you mentioned a bad, like my knees are bad, so I'm
Yeah.
not gonna squat. Whereas it's like, well, why don't we squat to help your knees? You know, like that mentality. Do you find that this is just so common still that people don't understand the very basic premise of lifting heavy and stimulus adaptation recovery and all that? Like I
Yes.
do. So do you?
Yeah,
It's
absolutely, and I
crazy. Yeah.
yeah, I this is the reason
Yeah.
why it's a principle that I teach in my course.
Yeah.
I teach to my students because I they might very well not be, um, programming for themselves. In fact, there's a very low likelihood that they're
Right.
doing their own programming, and in fact, some of them I'm like, Stop making up your own
Mm.
workouts.
Yeah.
Follow this plan or go work
Yeah.
with this coach, like,
Yeah.
because they're credible
Yeah,
and
there's good coaches, there's even
yeah.
good templates, just you
Yeah,
gotta
stop
find them. Yeah.
Bulgarian split
Mhm.
squatting 6 times a week or stop heavy deadlifting 5 times a week. Like,
Mm,
if it's truly heavy enough, you're not gonna be able to recover from it
no.
anyway that with that frequency. But I want them to feel empowered when they go into a gym
Yes,
or they work with their coach or their trainer or they see the workout of the day, that they're able to understand and rationalize also how the recovery pieces and the nutrition pieces fit
good
in
point.
there
Mhm.
so that they're able to sometimes make that choice of like, you know what? Yeah, I haven't slept great in the last few days. Like I've been having hot flashes. It's keeping me up at night, or work has been bananas and I've not really eaten very well. Like I don't feel great. My energy's super low. Maybe today isn't the day that I'm going to push for a 1 rep max or something like that.
Yep,
I'm going to, lean into RPE a little bit more or those sorts of things and adapt the workout. So helping them understand physiologically how it works is really important because a lot of people aren't professionals in this field. Like they don't have that education, and adult learners really need to understand the rationale, the reasons why, if they're going to adopt
agreed,
something,
agreed
especially
totally.
if it's a new thing and it's a little bit like, I don't know, this kind of contradicts with like a lot of the stuff I've ever seen out in the world or have been told about how the body works. So
I totally agree because otherwise you're left in this level of uncertainty where the information out there just comes in fast and furious,
yeah.
and if you don't know how any of it works, you're just gonna pick something, right? By explaining it and saying, "This is why this is the absolute," not absolute best, but really it is. I mean, there are some principles that are just superior,
Mhm.
right? And with confidence, like we do on podcasts and like you do with your coaching and training, then they can, maybe do it on their own. That's cool. Or maybe get the help that they need.
Yeah.
So an hour has flown by really fast here, Steph. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And you've got your podcast too that reaches out to a lot of people as well. What do you do for fun outside the fitness space, if I could ask?
Gosh, a lot of the things that I do even for fun are fitness focused. I feel like
Hmm.
I was put on this planet at this
That's
time
good though. That's
to
good.
encourage people to be active and to feel like the benefits of that, whether or not you ever compete is just like how movement benefits your life, and it doesn't have to be horrible and something that you hate or that all that kind of stuff. Yeah, so let's see, I really like Lord of the Rings.
So
I really
the best
enjoy,
trilogy ever, right?
yeah, the best
Okay.
trilogy ever. I like secretly like to put together Lego sets and stuff with my husband.
Oh,
Yeah, I
cool.
like
All
live a
right.
pretty low key life. Like
No, that's nice.
you know, it's just trying to enjoy every day as much as possible. And do Brazilian jiu-jitsu outside of lifting. I do rucking and I'm involved with some rucking events
Rocking.
as well.
Okay.
So
Beautiful.
yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, just to respect your time, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask every guest, and that
Okay.
is, what one question did you wish I had asked, and what is your answer?
Oh gosh. Okay. I think. One of the things I wish people would talk more about is this idea of optimizing, and sort of like biohacking, and
Okay.
like what my thoughts are on that. So, it's really easy to see this list of like 18 things you're supposed to do before 8 o'clock in the morning. And,
Hmm.
recently made an Instagram story about, this concept of like, you're not supposed shouldn't drink coffee for 90 minutes upon waking and those sorts of things. And yes, there's like a physiological basis to this, but the person I saw talking about it said like drinking coffee before then is literally pointless is the words that this person used. And I was like, wait a minute. So I think, we have to be a little bit careful sometimes in our zest to biohack everything
Yeah.
because of a few factors. But one of the most important ones, I think, is like we kind of miss some of the other strategies and principles, as we talked about, that are, even if we can nudge them a small percentage, are going to pay back dividends to like how we feel, our health and well-being, much greater than some of the like the little hacks and optimizing things that we
Hmm.
see that gain popularity, or they come back around like, yeah, like cold plunge or,
Yeah.
like morning sunlight and
Red
like,
light
yeah,
therapy.
like all
Yeah.
these things, like
Yeah.
they're, in a lot of ways, like there's a basis for these things. But for a lot of the more average folks that I work with, and I don't say that in a negative way, like I consider myself to be an
Yeah.
average
I
person
hear
who
you.
just really likes fitness. I'm not incredibly gifted at any one thing and I don't get paid to work out. I think that sometimes we kind of see like what's hot and what's popular and think like I feel a lot of pressure. Like I should do this thing too. And if I'm not, then I'm not doing a good enough job
Yep.
or
Missing out.
I'm somehow failing at
Yeah.
this, or I'm feeling a lot of undue like stress or anxiety about having to do all of these things. And so I guess if you have like the money, it feels like real fun to you and it's something that you're curious about and it feels like it fits in really well with your life. That's cool. But I also want to encourage people to sometimes just like take a beat
Hmm.
and think about like, am I doing some of these basics and can I nudge these basics a little bit better first before I put a lot of stress and pressure on myself to have to like go through this list of biohacking things and optimize every
Yeah.
single strategy. So, yeah, I think that's just one that I'm seeing a lot lately, and I'm hearing from people is I feel
That's a
like
good point. Yeah.
feel a lot of pressure to do all of these things, and I'm like, what if you did like 3 things and did them really well?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, yeah, I didn't think about that.
I hear you.
So,
I hear you. Yeah, I mean, there's so many like the grounding and there's everything else. If you just did it all, you'd spend 4 hours a day just biohacking.
yes,
You know, you're right. It gives you this little bit of anxiety of like all this stuff. So I like
yeah,
what you said. The nutrition and strength pyramids, or there's very there's similar models to that where
sure,
supplements are at the top.
yeah,
So hacking would be like a beetle on top of the pyramid, like standing on the
yeah,
tip or something.
totally.
Okay, cool. So where can listeners learn about you, Steph?
Yeah, so you can check out my podcast. It's Fuel Your Strength podcast. Fun fact is that this week is the 8th anniversary of the podcast in
Nice.
its different iterations. So feels like a really long time. So we have the podcast. I'm probably most active on Instagram, on social media, and then of course my website, stephgaudreau.com.
Awesome. Those will definitely go in the show links. And yeah, you were super responsive to me, so I appreciate it. It
Yeah.
was awesome having you on the show and
Thank
get a nice,
you.
refreshing take on women over 40, lifting, being an athlete, all this awesome stuff, fueling yourself.
Mhm.
Thank you again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.